Jonah, Democrats used to call themselves very commonly liberals. But today, more commonly, they use the term progressives. What does progressive actually mean?
In reality, there's a real serious philosophical history to the word progressive. And it means something much broader than just someone who does good things. It really goes back to this ancient idea of social engineering and social control, where experts and bureaucrats and government officials were going to guide society in a very specific forward direction towards an end goal in mind. That's where progressivism comes from.
So today, the term progressive is simply supposed to mean we're the party of the future and of progress,
Right.
and the other guys are the party of the past and of holding things back.
Right. Progressive is just the good guys, right? We are the guys who want all good things. We are the ones who want to take this country forward. You listen to the language of the left, and the language of the left is always about movement, going forward, getting to someplace.
Hope and change.
Hope and change, bridge to the 21st century. Meanwhile, the language of conservatism, properly understood, is about space. It's about giving people the space to live their lives, to live freely, to govern their lives as they see fit, where the fruits of their labor belong to them. And you can really understand a lot about the differences between right and left in this country, because movement means everyone has to march in step. Everyone has to go in a single direction. No one can fall out of line. Every drummer has to play to the same tune. And meanwhile, among conservatives and libertarians, the idea is no, the government is there to provide a space where people are safe in their property and to pursue happiness as they see it.
Now, in the 19th century, the term liberalism was often used to describe leave me alone.
Right.
Keep the government away from me, let me have a scope to live my life. When the progressives used the term progress, this is in the early 20th century.
Right.
Progress away from what?
Right. So the progressive era, which begins in the late 1800s and goes up until about the 1920s, the progressive era is basically a reaction to liberal democratic capitalism, to widespread prosperity, to economic liberty, and also to the chaos that comes, or the perceived chaos that comes from the Industrial Revolution, from mass urbanization. Remember, millions of people are pouring into cities, immigrants are coming in. It all seems very chaotic and scary to a lot of people. You know, in much the same way that I'm sure economic growth today in China seems scary to a lot of people who had a certain understanding of the way life was supposed to be organized. And the progressives are a reaction to all of this. The progressives have a perspective that says, we need to impose order on this. We've learned so much from science. We've learned so much from technology and engineering. This is when the phrase social engineer first enters the lexicon. And it's seen totally as a positive thing. I mean, you would say, hey, Bill's a great social engineer. It wasn't seen as like a scary Orwellian thing.
Because you're applying engineering techniques of science to society, to man.
That's right. That man is chaotic clay and must be organized and sculpted. And the progressives were going to come along, these technocrats, were going to come along and guide society and make it rational and less scary, because capitalism and freedom were just too scary to the intellectual classes. And the intellectual classes at the same time figured they better cut themselves in on the deal. And so in a lot of ways, it was a way to empower themselves to say, well, someone's got to impose order on society. Someone's got to be in charge. It can't be those greedy capitalists, right, who are just getting away with murder. It can't be the robber barons. It's got to be us. We've got to be in charge. We have to run things. And they took in the language of science and medicine, and they brought it into politics and said, hey, look, we're not partisan politicians. We're experts. We are political scientists. We are social engineers. And we know how to organize things and plan things. And of course, that's going to put us in charge.
Now, would it be right to say that America was a society formed to empower the entrepreneur, to have innovation, entrepreneurship, and all within a framework of liberty, laissez-faire. Let people do, let them live their lives. And then what happens in the early 20th century is that a new class of people who are not entrepreneurs, and in fact don't like entrepreneurs, figure out a way to say, not those guys, but we should have the levers of power in society. We should be sitting on top of the system, calling the shots.
Yeah, I think it's actually a very old story of intellectuals basically being envious of rich people, but not just rich people, of middle class people, of small business people, people who are carving out their life as they want to see it, and saying, hey, look, we know how to run your life better than you do. Where you have a certain class of sort of intellectuals who rise up that are only possible in rich societies, by the way, who then say, hey, look, wait a second, these capitalists, these businessmen, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to organize a society. Look at the people they're leaving behind. We should be a new aristocratic class, and we should be guiding society. We should be calling the shots. We're the real experts. We went to university. You know, a lot of the robber barons were very uneducated people who basically had read the Bible. And meanwhile, these intellectuals just thought they were smarter than everybody else. And they had a certain sort of will to power that said we should be in charge. And it was completely contrary to the ideas of the founding of this country. The classical liberal ideas of the founding of this country was that the fruits of your labor belong to you, that our rights come from God, not from government. We are citizens, not subjects. We are not there's no such thing as a hereditary title.
So progressivism is actually progress away from the founding.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why the progressive era is so important to understand is that it basically was a second American Revolution. It was the movement away from the idea of, not to get too eggheady about this, of negative liberty to positive liberty. Negative liberty used to say, and if you read the Bill of Rights, every one of them begins that government shall not do this. Congress shall pass no law doing that, right? It's the things that restrain government from infringing on your rights and my rights and everybody's rights. And positive liberty is sort of what you find in the old Soviet Union Constitution. You have a right to health care, a right to this, a right to that, a right to an income, a right to job. And the Second American Revolution, which was the Progressive Revolution, basically upended the ideas of the founding and said government has the power to run your life. Woodrow Wilson, who I have a bee in my bonnet about, Woodrow Wilson was the first president of the United States to openly campaign against the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, saying that that the old Constitution no longer mattered. It was Newtonian. It was mechanistic. What we need is a new Darwinian revolution that evolves. And what they mean by that is once you have a living Constitution, as people like to say it today, you need priests who can interpret the living Constitution. And that's what the Wilsonites, the progressives, saw themselves as. They were the ones who were going to read new meaning into the Constitution that gave them the power to do what they wanted to move society towards what they claimed was progress.
So in the 19th century, there were arguments about the Constitution, but both sides were pro-Constitution. Both sides said that we are correctly reading the Constitution, and you're saying for the first time with Wilson in the 20th century, the idea becomes that the founders didn't know what they were doing, or the Constitution is flawed. We need to, in a sense, do better.
Right. And so I think this is an important moment to explain that the progressive era it doesn't happen in isolation. It's not just something that happens in America. There was this grand sort of revolution in the way people thought in Europe and in the United States. It was seen as a transnational, awakening, where all of a sudden this idea that the state and that experts could guide people's lives. And in America, we called it progressivism. In the Soviet Union, they called it communism. In Italy, they called it fascism. These are all very similar movements in the sense that they all believed that the era of liberal democratic capitalism was over, that was chaotic. It was no longer applied in the post-industrial revolution era, and now was as I think it was Anne Morrow Lindbergh said, this was an idea whose time had come, right? That this was an idea where all of a sudden the experts and the intellectuals needed to be in charge because you couldn't have the kind of freedom that you had in the 19th century. Its expiration date had hit, and now was the era of the experts and of political parties and political movements that were going to guide society forward. And if you read like the early New Dealers, who were all progressives, their palpable envy of the Soviet Union and of fascist Italy alike. I think it was Rexford Tugwell, was one of the major brain trusters of FDR, he used to refer to the Russian-Italian method, because what he saw was in both countries planning, which empowers the planners.
So the Italian was Mussolini, was fascism.
Right, the Italian was Mussolini and fascism, and in the Soviet Union it was Bolshevism. And obviously there are differences, because there are differences between Russia and Italy, and there are differences between the kind of movements that succeeded. But what unites them is far more similar than what divides them. And what united them was this idea of a revolutionary movement of experts that were going to guide society in totality, with nobody left behind. You know, it's Benito Mussolini who coins the term totalitarian. And today we think of totalitarian as like this evil Orwellian thing, right? There's that famous line from George Orwell where he conjures the image of a jackboot stomping on a human face, right?
Right.
But he didn't mean it that way. I mean, what Mussolini meant by totalitarian was holistic, inclusive, no child left behind, everyone's in it, we're all gonna work together, we're gonna make this the best yearbook ever. You know, I mean, it was like that kind of uplifting kind of cult of unity that he meant by totalitarian. And that spirit, that ethos, guided the progressive movement. It guided, later it would guide the Nazi movement in Germany. It certainly guided all the different socialist movements. Mussolini, remember, comes out of the socialist movement in Europe. But anyway, we're getting a little far afield.
So you're saying that fascism and communism self-consciously viewed themselves as progressive, as the party of the future against the party of the past.
Absolutely. All of their rhetoric is about seizing the future. It's about winning the future. It's about discarding they use a lot of language like the corpse of democratic capitalism and or classical liberalism, you know.
And so even though the fascists appealed to the master race and the communists extolled the master class, the proletariat,
Right.
You're saying that those differences are less important than the fact that all these guys are creating planned societies that organize the lives of ordinary people,
Right.
and they, in a sense, ordain themselves to be at the top.
Right. The only thing I would correct you on that, which I think is a kind of important point that gets lost in all this, is that Italian fascism wasn't about a master race. Italian fascism wasn't racist, at least not until the late 1930s, where Mussolini basically has to become a lickspittle to Hitler, and they import all of these Nazi racist laws. Mussolini comes out of a much more recognizable progressive tradition. The flagship magazine of American liberalism, The New Republic, celebrated Benito Mussolini throughout the 1920s. FDR had nice things to say about Benito Mussolini.
What did he say about Mussolini?
FDR and lots of people in his orbit had lots of nice things to say about Benito Mussolini. Frances Perkins, who was the Secretary of Labor under FDR, she handed out fascist tracts from the Italian government to fellow cabinet secretaries. A guy named Hugh Johnson was the guy who ran the NRA, not the National Rifle Association, but the National Recovery Administration, the single most important part of the early New Deal, the whole idea of the economic revival. And he was an unabashed fan of Benito Mussolini. He hung a portrait of Benito Mussolini in his White House office.
Now, these guys love Mussolini. What was Mussolini's take on FDR?
Well, it's funny. I mean, obviously, all of this changes as you lead up to World War II, right? Then battle lines are drawn and everything gets different. But in the early days, certainly before Hitler comes on the scene or becomes on the scene as Hitler, it was almost a mutual admiration society. There's this great review where Mussolini reviews, I think it's Rendezvous with Destiny or whatever it is. Mussolini reviews FDR's book and says, hey, this guy's one of us. He's a fascist. And it's important to remember that fascism back then wasn't about the Holocaust, and it wasn't about killing Jews. It was about planning and experimenting and ushering in this new progressive era.
And part of what the fascists wanted to do was, unlike the socialists, they didn't want necessarily the government to own all the means of production, but they wanted the state to control the major industries, state control of banking, state control of insurance, state control of hospitals. Isn't there a kind of echo with what we have today in America?
Oh, sure. So the fundamental economic idea behind fascism was this idea of corporatism. Now, the left hears the word corporatism and thinks it means rule by corporations. It's not what it means. corporatism is a old Catholic doctrine that comes out of medieval Europe, and it means all of the big institutions, the guilds, the church, today what we would think of as labor unions and teachers unions and the media would all sit around a table, the stakeholders, as Barack Obama likes to put it, sit around a table and they all coordinate how to run the economy, how to run the society. And Hitler was once asked, why didn't you nationalize all of the industry? And it's important to remember, nationalism and socialism are the same thing, right? When you nationalize an industry, you're socializing an industry. But anyway, he was asked why you didn't nationalize everything, and he says, well, we don't need to socialize the economy. We're socializing human beings. And the whole approach under Nazi economics and under Italian fascist economics was, as long as you get all of the crony capitalists, all of the leaders of industry and of unions behind closed doors, and you cut deals to everybody, locking out the little guy, locking out the small businessman, then we can all work together, as long as all the oars are pulling together. And you listen to the rhetoric of Barack Obama about how he sold Obamacare, right, where they got all these lobbyists in the room, and the lobbyists were asked, why were you doing this? Why was the healthcare industry willing to go in there? And these major lobbyists would say things like, well, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that is the essence of corporatism, is this idea of get the big players around and then freeze out everybody else.
And Obama's offering them a deal, isn't he? He's saying to these insurance companies, look, I'm going to be forcing all these Americans who don't want to buy insurance to buy insurance.
Right.
And so I'm going to be creating millions of new customers for you.
Right.
So by supporting the plan, your profits go up.
Also, I'm going to restrain the ability of you to have any competition, right? When you basically, the fascistic look of politics is to turn big corporations into utilities, where they have guaranteed market share and guaranteed profits, and in exchange, they have to agree to things like employing X number of people, and they have to agree to getting on board progressive ideas, whether it's about climate change or anything, or mandatory healthcare requirements and all the rest. It is all about getting everybody to march single file in a single direction. And it's interesting, the fundamental idea behind fascism for a lot of people is militarism, right? Which actually comes out of an American idea called the moral equivalent to war. A philosopher named William James did this, which fascinated American progressives. John Dewey supported World War I because he thought the war would force everybody to give up their petty associations and their individual liberties and march in step. Much of the reason why the progressives liked fascist Italy and the Soviet Union in the 1920s is because they felt that they were doing the exact same thing under Woodrow Wilson's war socialism, coordinating the economy, getting big business in line, and then we abandoned it to go back to quote-unquote normalcy, which meant freedom and prosperity. But Barack Obama, in his State of the Union address a few years ago, after the killing of Osama bin Laden, he gave this very creepy speech where he said something to the effect of, wouldn't it be great if America was more like SEAL Team 6, where we all dropped our petty partisan differences and just all worked together towards the common national interest of America? Now, talk about overturning the idea of the founding, right? The idea of the founding is that we are all free, we're captains of ourselves, as John Locke would put it, that the fruit of our labors belong to us and we get to pursue happiness as we see fit. The reason why we have a military in that vision is to keep us free at home. That's why you have a military. It's to defend the homeland and defend our interests. Under Obama's vision of it, it flips that on its head and says, no, the purpose of a military is to provide an example of how we can profitably abandon our liberties and all march in step like a military unit. And that idea is a constant in American political history among liberals and progressives. It goes back to World War I. The New Deal was modeled explicitly, and FDR campaigned on this, explicitly as saying he was going to take the methods that we used in World War I to fight the war and use them to fight the Great Depression. Almost all of the major institutions of the New Deal come directly out of the war socialism structure of the government under Woodrow Wilson.
And then later, the war on poverty.
And the war on poverty, NASA, Barack Obama at the beginning of his first term talked about Sputnik moments, right? He was trying to conjure the spirit of the Cold War to say, that's what we need to do, is rally around as if it were a threat from a foreign enemy, right? Paul Krugman, the columnist in the New York Times, talks about how profitable it would be if we were attacked by aliens, because that would cause us to all unite and spend on war. And this idea of having war mobilization without war is the defining idea of much of American liberalism in the last 100 years, in part because if you can get society to organize and mobilize as if they're a war and drop all of their personal pursuits, you need generals, right? And the generals get to be the liberals or the progressives, because they're the ones who get to tell people which way to march. And you find this in the rhetoric on global warming, you find this in the it comes up constantly throughout the 20th century. Jimmy Carter said the energy crisis had to be the new moral equivalent of war, sitting in the Oval Office with that ridiculous sweater of his.
What do you say to someone who says, I'm a Democrat because under the Democrats we have a government that cares about me?
I say lots of things. First of all, there's simply no evidence that the government actually cares about you as an individual person. It turns out that it can't. In a country of 310 million people, we care about people whose faces we know, whose names we know. That's how we're wired. But it is a natural tendency of people to want security, to want meaning from government, right? And this is what I call sort of the fundamental error of politics. It's a mistake that libertarians never make. It's one that conservatives only occasionally make. And it's one that progressives consider the heart of their worldview, right? And this mistake is simply this. The government can't love you. It can't be your mommy. It can't be your daddy. It can't be your tribe, your synagogue, your church. It can't be anything other than government. And so much of American history, so much of world history, of political history, is of politicians and leaders promising that somehow the state will fill the holes in our soul, will give us meaning. That's what fascism was about, what communism was about, is this idea of giving people a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than themselves, right? And I hate this phrase. I hate it when people say, when I hear politicians say, I believe that we should all dedicate ourselves to a cause larger than ourselves. Because what they mean by that is they're trying to seduce you into loyalty to the state and loyalty to government. Right?
And to them.
And to them. It's about getting people to define themselves in relationship to Washington and some government program. The reality is that, except for a few serial killers, we are all dedicated to causes larger than ourselves. My family is a cause larger than myself, right? I mean, I would give my life for my daughter. Our jobs, our friends, our local communities, these are all causes that are larger than ourselves. The problem is when you try to convince people to define themselves simply in relationship to government, and that somehow the government is going to give you that sense of belonging and that sense of feeling part of something. And I think that the Democrats are much, much better at telling that story, particularly at a time, as FDR was and as Barack Obama was, where there are major social changes at work. The 1930s, 1920s, this is a time of the largest mass migration in American history, of rapid urbanization, rampant industrialization, not just in America, but in Europe. And FDR pointedly said he's appealing to the forgotten man. Lots of people felt like they were sort of caught in the switches, that they were left behind. That's common language. And to a certain extent they were. They left their settled communities, and they moved to a big city, and they felt lost. And here was the government that was going to come in and play the role of daddy for them and provide for them and make them feel safe and secure.
So you're saying that in the early 20th century, when Americans were moving from living on farms and doing farming,
right,
and suddenly you didn't need to do that anymore. Suddenly a small number of people could feed the whole country, and so you had to get off the farm, and that wasn't easy.
Right.
And that today, with technology, with immigration, globalization, whole industries are being wiped out, and all kinds of people find, right, where's my American dream?
Right. Well, and also, look, I mean, put aside the American dream for just a second. Our sense of meaning as people, we are hardwired to get our sense of meaning as people from our families and from our close personal relationships. And as you see, the out-of-wedlock birth rate in this country, the breakdown of the traditional family, the breakdown of traditional communities, people feel lost. And when people feel lost, they look to someone who's promising to provide leadership. I mean, do you remember the Life of Julia ad that the Obama administration put out, where this poor girl, this fictional girl named Julia, every frame begins with the words, under President Obama. And under President Obama, Julia gets this kind of scholarship and this kind of loan and this kind of promised job and this kind of deal on her mortgage, all the way out to the end of her life, where at the end of her life, under President Obama, she gets to work in a community garden. She doesn't even get to work in her own garden, right? It has got to be this community garden. And in the process, the creepiest sentence in modern American political history was when Barack Obama, when the Life of Julia ad says, under President Obama, Julia decides to have a child, which just makes me feel unsafe, right? But the point I'm trying to make is that nowhere in this do you see Julia's family. There are no parents, there's no husband, there are no friends. It's just the state as personified by Barack Obama and the individual as personified by Julia. And the state is providing all of the things that community, churches, synagogues, family, friends, mediating institutions, as the social scientists call them, that give us a sense of order and place in the world. That's what the role of the state is playing.
But look at it also now from Obama's angle, because it looks to me that these progressive Democrats who make this pitch,
right,
this kind of sale, are actually arrogating to themselves the kind of power that even kings and aristocrats did not have. Kings and aristocrats did not rule the lives of ordinary people. They might have authority over the nobles.
Right.
But even then, if they wanted to go to war, they had to beg the nobles to give them money.
Right. Right.
The idea that an Obama can not only control the levers of industry, but essentially regulate each aspect of your life, from birth control to puberty, to the kind of job you get, to where you get your everyday satisfactions, that's an enormous amount of power over your life.
It is, if he closes the sale. And one of the things that really worries me is that as you see traditional institutions, the pews in most churches are going empty, except, at least in the mainline Protestant churches. Certainly in Europe, they're completely empty. All the churches have been turned into concert halls. And the traditional sources of meaning and belonging start to evaporate, primarily with the family, the traditional family. Then people's desire to belong, to feel part of something, doesn't go away simply because the traditional sources of satisfying it are gone. They start looking to the state. And the opening video of the Democratic Convention in 2012 began with the words, government is the one thing we all belong to, right? So as a Tea Party kind of guy, that makes me want to flip the safety on my rifle, right? I mean, that's creepy because it completely inverts the idea of the founding. The idea of the founding is, no, government belongs to us. We don't belong to it. We are citizens, not subjects. But the Democratic Convention promotional video is not pitching to my ear. It's pitching to people who want that sense of belonging. They want to feel like they're part of something. And this is ultimately the problem, that because government can't love you, this pitch is fool's gold. It's very seductive. It's a siren song. It's very compelling, and it gets people to vote their aspirations and their desires. But the government never delivers. And part of the reason why it never delivers is because it can't. Government can't love you. But when it fails to deliver, it needs a scapegoat. So it points to conservatives and libertarians and big business and says, the problem was we didn't have enough control over these things. If we just had a little more control over these things, if we could just ratchet it up just a little bit, then we could fulfill these promises of delivering everybody to this utopian world. And it can never happen. The irony is that capitalism, liberal democratic capitalism, is the single most cooperative, peaceful, successful anti-poverty program in human history. In fact, it's pretty much the only one. It has one serious flaw. It doesn't feel like it. It doesn't give you that sense of belonging and that sense of meaning of being part of something. That's what you get from family and religion and all sorts of other things. But you don't get it from capitalism. You might get it from the business that you're building and the wonderful things you're doing with your business and giving people a job and building a product that has value. But the system itself doesn't fill the hole in your soul. And so the story of politics in America, at least for the last 100 years, if not the last since its founding, is the story of people desperate to find a system that feels more natural, that feels like the government is loving us, that goes back to this old aristocratic notion where the lord and king cares for all of his subjects like they were children. We're sort of wired to want that. And progressives are much better at telling a story that satisfies or that appeals to that desire. And it turns out that it's actually very difficult to sell freedom and prosperity. Well, prosperity is easy to sell. It's very difficult to sell freedom and liberty to people who don't feel like they're benefiting from it or they're taking it for granted.
Now, honestly, isn't this the sales pitch in the opening scene of The Godfather, where Don Corleone says to Bonacera, you came to America, you wanted freedom, you wanted the American dream,
Right.
you thought the cops could protect you. You're discovering that you need a more holistic form of love.
Right.
You need a godfather.
Right.
And that's me. And so if you're willing to give me that subordination, that respect, as he calls it, I'll take care of you.
Right, and that's the ancient Roman understanding of what politics is about, is you take care of your friends, and you punish your friends' enemies, and it's a transactional thing, and it's funny, this gets to an interesting, point. There's a reason why the big city machine politicians, the bosses, right, the sort of Tammany types, fed so easily into progressivism. Because it turns out that despite all of the great rhetoric and salesmanship of progressive intellectuals, it's actually really different to have quote-unquote disinterested experts running things. Turns out that people have biases. People are self-serving. People have self-interests. And progressivism, by giving unprecedented power to bureaucrats and politicians, you had this sort of, it was like this you had these corrupt bosses in these big cities saying, we must have won the lottery. Because all of a sudden we now have this rhetoric that sounds so high-minded and so proper, when in reality what it was a license to take care of your friends and punish your enemies and build up your own little personal fiefdoms at the local level. And that's why, just look at what happened with unions in the Democratic Party. There's a reason why they were so susceptible to the mob. It's because the logic of the mob, this Godfather logic of transactional, help your friends and punish your enemies kind of thing, fits perfectly with the structure that inevitably flows from the progressive rhetoric and the progressive idea of the government being this disinterested thing. I've never met a politician who didn't do favors for people. But the whole idea of the American founding was that we were going to check the ability of politicians to do more than what they were supposed to do. Under progressivism and the living constitution and this idea that we're going to be run by experts, there is no limiting principle. There's no reason not to give these guys ever more power. And that's how you get corrupt big city bosses, that's how you get corrupt unions, that's how you get self-dealing public officials, because they get all of this power because of this crazy academic notion, and when the reality of it hits the street, it just becomes a license for people to boss people around and to freeze out your enemies and create machine politics.
Isn't it also true that it provides a peculiar form of immortality? If you drive around West Virginia, you see the Robert Byrd Highway and the Robert Byrd Community Center and the Robert Byrd Museum and the Robert Byrd Cancer this and the Robert Byrd Hospital. Now, normally when you see buildings with people's names on them, those people have paid for those buildings. They've made donations to a college that named a building. Now, Robert Byrd made no donations to any of these groups. What he actually did was appropriate taxpayer money, your money and my money, assigned it to something, and that something got named not after us, who paid for it, but after this guy, who was essentially the guy who appropriated the funds. So progressivism empowers people to achieve a certain kind of status.
Absolutely, and it steals this notion of compassion, right? That somehow Robert Byrd is this unbelievably compassionate figure for taking other people's money and spending it on people in his state, right? And meanwhile, it's greedy to want to hold on to your money and not have a politician take it away. And this is part of this whole, this confusion about the role of government that is actually, that it imbues sort of human characteristics to it. Compassionate and generous when they're giving other people's money, when in fact what they're doing is they're acquiring power for themselves and sometimes money for themselves while buying votes and loyalty from the people in their various fiefdoms.
What is the significance of Woodrow Wilson?
Woodrow Wilson was easily the most racist president of the 20th century. He's the guy who brings Jim Crow in earnest to Washington, D.C. He segregates Washington, D.C. He's the pioneer of putting people's pictures on their job applications so people could be able to tell if they were black or not. He's the first president, I think the only president, to be elected to the White House who regretted that the South lost the Civil War. He thought it was a damn shame that it ended the way it did. But interestingly, he admired Abraham Lincoln. Woodrow Wilson's take on Lincoln is, it's a damn shame that he had to end slavery, but look how great he was at accruing all of this power into the White House. He loved the dictatorial aspects of Lincoln and hated what he did with the power. The right position from my perspective is, you're supposed to hate the power, but like what he did with it. It was a necessary evil. It was a tool. When Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton, he had this line which he used all the time, where he said, the chief job of an educator is to make your children as unlike you as possible. He believed that the boys that he was educating, he should make them as different from their fathers as possible. And what he meant by that was this progressive idea of seeing people as clay and getting them to let go of these traditional understandings about the Constitution, about the role of government, about a whole host of things. And he brought that mindset into the White House, where once he was elected, he actually said, if you're not a progressive, you better watch out. And he combined virulent racism against what he called hyphenated Americans. When he gives these speeches where he says, a man with a hyphen in his name, right? If you called yourself an Indian American rather than an American, that the hyphen is a dagger poised at the heart of the body politic and all these kinds of things. And he was, in every sense that we think of in contemporary political discourse, he was a fascist. He had goons that beat people up in public, that did interrogations, that broke store windows. He believed in the marriage of big business and big government together. He had propaganda agents called 4-Minute Men who would go all around the country promoting, not revealing who they were, and inciting crowds to hate the Germans and to love Woodrow Wilson. He puts political opponents in jail. It was the first time we ever had large numbers of political prisoners put in jail simply because of what they believed.
So what you're saying is that propaganda and intimidation are key elements of progressivism from the beginning, because we see echoes of that today, but you're saying there's nothing new about that.
Yeah, if anything, it's less intense than it was and certainly of the violent side of it isn't what we had under Woodrow Wilson. I mean, what we had under Woodrow Wilson was truly terrifying. And you asked earlier, we were talking about this change from progressive to liberal and how liberals today call themselves progressives now, right? It was because of all of these things that were happening under Woodrow Wilson, the censorship, the prosecution of thought crimes, people being thrown in jail just for having disagreements in their home. A documentary maker was put in jail for making a documentary about the Revolutionary War that cast the British in a bad light. And this was seen as seditious because the British were our allies during the war, during World War I. Americans got so sick of this, the rationing and the censorship and all of the rest and the propaganda, that in 1920, they threw out all of these progressives. And the Republicans ran on what they called a return to normalcy, which is really a return to 19th century notions of peace, prosperity, normalcy, right? And this infuriated progressives. And one of the reasons why they lost the election is because they so ruined the word progressive, right? And so the Republicans launched this era of peace and prosperity. They let all the political prisoners out of jail. It was the Republicans who let Eugene V. Debs, the socialist politician, let him out of jail. Woodrow Wilson never would have done it. And you have this decade of prosperity and everything's going red, good times are here again and all of that. And that it is this moment where American progressives start casting their eye overseas. And they look at Mussolini's Italy, and they look at Lenin's Russia, and they say, gosh, look at these guys. They are doing what we were doing here first. They're stealing our bit. They're taking our playbook. And there was a guy named George Soule, who wrote, that famously wrote, "We planned in war." And this idea was that this war planning, this moral equivalent to war argument, that we needed to bring it back in peacetime and use it to guide the economy. And it's not until you get FDR, who openly campaigns to bring back all of the stuff that they did under Woodrow Wilson. And remember, FDR was a official in the Wilson administration. Right. He's a Wilson retread. He's the first Democrat to make it back. And in 1932, he gets in campaigning on a promise to bring back all of the techniques that they used during World War I to fight the Great Depression. He's explicitly using all of the language of war to talk about how we're going to mobilize society. And these guys who had spent the 1920s looking enviously at fascist Italy and at communist Russia say, aha, we finally have power again, and we're not going to let go of it. And that is the driving force through the early New Deal, is the progressives once again have control of state power.
Now, one of the very important strands of modern progressivism was the idea of eugenics, the idea of birth control, not just voluntary birth control, but forced birth control, sterilization.
Right.
Who is the figure that comes to mind who embodies this, and what can you say about it?
I mean, the obvious answer to the question is Margaret Sanger, right? Margaret Sanger was the founder of Planned Parenthood. She was the editor of a magazine called the Birth Control Review, and she really was the popularizer of birth control. Now, birth control is actually a very good thing, right? People should be, women and men, you know, they should have autonomous power to decide, you know, to be able to control the kind of family that they want to have, right? We're not talking about abortion, we're talking about, you know,
space out your kids if you want, or
yeah,
have 2 instead of 8.
Right, you know, condoms and all of that kind of stuff, right? That's all fine. And she was thrown in jail for handing out condoms and all that. And that's the side of Margaret Sanger that the left loves to celebrate, right? This champion of individual autonomy and women's liberation. She was one of the first feminists. Fine, that's all fine to celebrate. But they leave out the fact that the birth control movement was entirely entrenched in the eugenics movement. To talk about the eugenics movement and the birth control movement as separate things, really easy today, right? Most people who talk about birth control today don't think that they're talking about eugenics. But back in the 19-teens and the 1920s, through the 1930s, they were two sides of the same coin. And it's important to remember, eugenics was immensely popular back then. Virtually all of the economists who are the founders of the progressive movement were soaked to the bone eugenicists, right? It was really funny. When Barack Obama won the nomination in 2008, he gave a speech at the University of Wisconsin where he says, what better place than here at the University of Wisconsin, where the progressive movement was born, to celebrate our victory and the victory of our movement, right? So this is the place where he nailed the nomination, and he gives this speech at the University of Wisconsin talking about how great, and this shows this beautiful continuity of the moral arc of the universe, that this is where the progressive movement was born, and it kind of was. All the progressive intellectuals, a lot of them were centered around the University of Wisconsin. And I've actually spoken at the University of Wisconsin, and I always love to point out that, you know, virtually all of the intellectuals, E.A. Ross and the Richard Ely, you know, all these guys were soaked to the bone racist eugenicists who would be horrified at the idea that Barack Obama's family could move to this country, never mind that this guy could be president of the United States. The early champions of the minimum wage, the early champions of almost all the labor laws, they're all eugenicists. Sidney Webb, the famous Fabian socialist in England, said there's no way you can be a socialist and not a eugenicist. Because remember, we were talking about how there's this explosion of science and engineering and all these kind of things. There's also this explosion of medical science. And people took the logic of dog breeding and applied it to humanity. And all of these experts and bureaucrats who wanted to run the economy thought you couldn't do that unless you also ran the gene pool. And so the New Republic, you know, there's this great editorial. It's unsigned, but it was obviously written by Herbert Crowley, who was the founding editor of the New Republic. There were two kinds of eugenicists back then. There were the eugenicists who believed in exterminating the unfit, wiping them out, getting rid of them, right? And then there were the eugenicists who believed that if we improved the economy and uplifted you would lift out a lot of the sort of people who seemed unfit, but were really just poor, right? And the New Republic says, this is sort of a false choice. Obviously, we've got to do both. We've got to weed out the unfit, and we've got to have this sort of socialist program of lifting up the poor. And then if there are any unfit left at the end, we'll wipe them out too.
And Margaret Sanger was not so much an advocate of, you might say, positive eugenics, which is to say, how do you improve people? She was more an advocate of negative eugenics. How do we get rid of the people who would be polluting the human race?
Right. So there's this basic idea that the unfit, the dregs of society, were outbreeding the elites. Right. W.E.B. Du Bois, foundational black intellectual of liberalism, he referred to the talented tenth, where about a tenth of the black community was up to snuff eugenically, and then the rest was sort of problematic. This sort of logic suffused throughout the progressive movement, and it was also mainstream. I mean, this is sort of one of these ideas whose time had come. But so Margaret Sanger championed this idea of empowering women to be able to control their birth, but it was also part of a larger plan of getting the young and poor women, the unfit, to stop having so much babies so that we wouldn't have what she called, I think it was cradle competition, where the unfit were outbreeding the fit.
So this brings us to the issue of pro-choice, because when we say the word pro-choice, we seem to think that we give every person a choice, and that
Right.
birth control is about giving people a choice. So how can Sanger, on the one hand, say I'm pro-choice, and on the other hand, you got to have fewer kids? If you don't have fewer kids, we're going to try to convince you, and if we can't convince you, we're going to make you.
One way to look at it is so much of the rhetoric among liberals generally about being pro-choice, not just about having kids, but about your life choices and all these kinds of things. The campuses say we're all about individual liberty. What they mean is you should be absolutely free to agree with me entirely, right? And one of the brilliant things that Sanger did was, and there's some merit to this, obviously, was to convince people, was to disentangle sex from procreation. That sex could be something that's enjoyable, and I think most people will agree that that's in fact true. And the thinking was that if you could get people to see sex as something as recreational, you could then convince them of the importance of birth control. But at the same time, the push to have, I don't know that Sanger really used the modern language of pro-choice, right? The modern language of pro-choice is fairly market-tested, pretty modern. She was much more heavy-handed about this stuff. It was much more judgmental, finger-wagging, bullying was a big part of it. And a big part of it was also liberationist, but I don't think you can sort of disentangle both.
How would you describe Margaret Sanger's so-called Negro Project? What was that all about?
Well, Margaret Sanger's Negro Project is a really touchy subject. Her defenders say what Margaret Sanger was doing was just simply including the black community in a larger social movement that was important, right? That was vital for all women. And what the Negro Project was, and in some ways, from her perspective, that's absolutely true. There are lots of people who want to say that Margaret Sanger was motivated by racism. I don't think that's right. I think what Margaret Sanger was motivated by was a kind of elitism, this sort of technocratic expertise, and thought that the same things that was ruining a lot of the white population, the unfit dregs of society outbreeding the refined, decent people, was also happening in the black community. And for obvious reasons having to do with the unique history of black America, when you talk about eugenics and blacks, it sets off all sorts of alarm bells. So anyway, the Negro Project was to bring these birth control and other eugenic measures into the black community. She hired black ministers expressly to sell the idea that we weren't just trying to wipe out black people. And I'm pretty sure that was a sincere desire, because that would be a bad sell. But you can see how some of those kinds of ideas fed into things like the Tuskegee Project, where black subjects were treated as sort of medical test subjects. You can certainly understand, given the history of African Americans in this country, that these sorts of projects, when aimed at blacks, sound much more sinister, particularly when any talk of eugenics sounds so Nazi now, right? I know it sounds like you're just talking about wiping out Jews and minorities and all of the rest, and I don't think that's how they saw it.